Yes, I think economic risks are easier to look at to forecast than financial risks because, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, we could see that there was a problem in the U.S. housing market. There was no doubt there was a bubble there, and there was a bubble related to subprime mortgages, and it's because of years of deregulation in that area where and banks being basically able to make and making mortgages and packaging mortgages. But you could see the problem. But what was quite opaque was the level of risk within the derivatives market, because what really happened in the fall of 2008, it wasn't just the housing; it was all these credit default swaps all across Wall Street and around the financial world. We had all these derivatives with a colossal notional values. Now most of it should cancel out, but it's very difficult at any point in time to know exactly how it all cancels out. And what's more, we'd set up a system where they all cancel out if everybody pays the bills. But the problem was with the structure of derivatives that if you had one bad player at the table who promised to make good on all these bills and then actually went bankrupt, then suddenly the whole edifice looked difficult, and there was no way of knowing who was broke or who wasn't, and that caused the whole credit markets to freeze up. Now, in hindsight, it's easy to say, "Oh, that was inevitable," but it wasn't inevitable. I mean, first of all, we could have avoided it altogether if we had been as bold in dealing with Lehman Brothers as we've subsequently been in dealing with other financial crises. But also wasn't clear that the full scale of the Federal Reserve wouldn't move appropriately, and the federal government wouldn't move appropriately in passing TARP fast enough. So in hindsight, these things look obvious. At the time, it wasn't obvious that this would, the subprime crisis in the US would turn into the global financial crisis. That wasn't obvious at all. But I do accept that at least economic issues, financial issues, may be a little easier to see. But I think we always assume this sort of normal distribution of risks based on what we've seen in the past. And there are black swans. The pandemic is a black swan. I said, nuclear could be a black swan. Meteorite, an earthquake,
Yeah, anything.
could
Yeah,
be a huge problem. It's hard, admittedly. I mean, the fascinating thing about the pandemic is it would have been really hard beforehand to come up with any crisis, no matter how bad, which would actually zap the entire world at the same time. And the pandemic did that, as did the global financial crisis. That's very unusual. Those are really. It's hard to think of a third example of something beyond thermonuclear war, and then who cares?
yeah, yeah.
But
Exactly, exactly.
but
Yeah,
but the
yeah, for sure.
but it's otherwise it's hard to find a global problem. But it's the point I make though is that these things are unpredictable, and you hedge against predictable risks. You diversify against unpredictable risks, and
Yeah.
that's one of the major argument for diversification is, but you don't know which way the next shock is going to hit you from, or what direction it's going to come from.
Yeah, yeah.
If you'd like to hear this interview in its entirety, then head on over to SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other major podcast platform and search Four Corners Podcast.